Well, I think the recording's already begun, so I should just introduce you as Gigi Foster at the University of New South Wales, a professor of economics, and the co-author of this glorious book. I've held this book up 100 times. It's so good, right?
Well, so
yeah. Oh, look at you. Yeah. Is your edition the same as mine, even though you're on the other side of the world?
It's the same edition, but I have some markings because I've been doing in-person book launches here with readings and stuff. So I have little sections that I like to read, depending on the audience and the mood and what we're talking about. It's useful.
Well, tell me which sections you like to read the most. Which one do you?
I tell you, that the crowds chapter seems to be the most impactful for many people because they just haven't thought about the crowd dynamic previously because we haven't observed it really in our lifetimes, most of us, or, we sort of learned about crowds, but never really thought it could apply to our lives today. So I think that is a really useful one. And also people like to hear about the scale of the tragedy, just from a very objective standpoint. What have lockdowns done to us? What have we lost? Not just in the developed world, but in the developing world. So that's useful. Sometimes the political economy, just generally, to the Middle Ages analogy, the analogy to, feudalism in today's sort of way in which corporations and governments collude and sort of control populations more than we might think they do, or than you would think if you aren't analyzing it. And also the bad macro section, that's one that's popular. And I like that one because, it's basically taking a direct aim at some of the people within the academy, my colleagues, unfortunately, who have just gone right along with this madness and been apologists for it. And it illustrates the corruption of science during this period from a very personal standpoint, because obviously all three of us are economists. And we've seen some of the worst, rationalizations. I mean, worst in the sense of most offensive, and non-aligned with the goals of economics in normal times coming out of our discipline. So,
right, it's a bit of a shock, which is, I think, one of the reasons that I don't know. It's hard to say when I first read the manuscript. I think it was that section on crowds that affected me too the most. Although today on the Brownstone website, I ran the general section against lockdowns, which is actually very strangely calm, because it's like, well, lockdowns sound intuitively correct, but there are at least two obvious problems and one slightly unobvious problem. But so I was surprised at just how weirdly calm that section is, because lockdowns are a massive violation of every principle of liberalism as we think about it. And so but that section is dialed back. You're very patiently explaining.
Well, I mean, we thought that was necessary because we're just surrounded by people who have bought into the lockdown ideology, and they will have in their minds a very facile sort of reason why lockdowns should work. And so we address that very directly in that section, as you know, right? We say, look, on the surface of it, the idea is that, you prevent people from interacting with each other and therefore transmitting the virus. That's what people believe. That's what they think when they think lockdown. They think that's what I'm doing. But they don't realize how many other collateral problems are happening, and also how little that particular objective is actually being serviced because of the fact that we live in these interdependent societies now, and we also are trapping people often in large buildings, sharing air together, not able to go outside as much, and so we're actually potentially increasing the spread of the virus, at least within communities, communities. So it's it basically is an example of trying to engage with the people we feel are misguided on this issue in a calm way, not screaming at each other, not sort of taking the radical position on either side and just saying, I'm going to play gotcha with you, because that's not productive. To move forward, which we want this book to help us do as societies, we need to start being able to talk to each other more about these really important issues and engage with each other. I mean, that is also one of the principles of classic liberalism. You have to be able to investigate and try new things, experiment, and engage with each other respectfully and be open, and not get stuck in the mud and into routines and with just some narrow monovision that you disobey, you get ostracized from the group. That's just not the way to develop a healthy society. So we do think that kind of effort is important, and yes, it is frustrating. It was difficult. Some chapters were hard to write in that calm way because I mean, obviously, all three of us are absolutely, just deeply offended and incredibly angry. And, we've been in the depths of despair, like I'm sure you have as well, at seeing the destruction during this period. And it's heartrending, heartrending. And so, we also felt we could get some of that emotion out through the stories of Jane and James and Jasmine.
Yeah.
We do put a bit of it into the chapter on the tragedy, right, where we talk about the costs of these lockdowns. But in terms of the scientific presentation, we try to keep the emotion out of it.
I thought about running your whole section on Jasmine because she looks, that your description, because it's basically autobiographical, right? I mean, yeah. So I like that. Let me just back up a little bit because one of the things that struck me is this was why the whole book is important, because if you just read it in isolation, you only get a piece of the thing that matters. But I liked your chapter on viruses and immunology and immune systems too, because like one of the things your whole section on lockdown holds out this possibility. You're like, well, this is not practical. Maybe you can avoid the pathogen if you lock down, maybe, but that's not how we've chosen to live, and that's not the reality of the world. But there's a slight problem with that too, because then you get this naive immune system problem, which is potentially more deadly even than governments.
Absolutely. No, I mean, and you ran a piece on the Brownstone Institute about, how great natural immunity is and how it is basically one of the fundamentals of virology in terms of, virology 101. You learn about the importance of a natural immune system, and that is our main primary defense against pathogens in general. And we've just sort of forgotten that exists during this period in terms of our policy responses. And indeed, lockdowns have a number of really negative effects on people's immune systems, right? I mean, we can't interact with other people. We're not outside. We're not getting the sunlight. We're not having exercise as much. We are more stressed. So we eat things that are worse for us. And all of those things we know are bad. Plus, crowded out healthcare for, preventative kinds of visits and like screenings, and also acute problems, which could also hurt us. So there's just all sorts of damage that we do to our society's immune systems when we lock people down. So yes, I mean, that was an interesting chapter to write as well, because for us it was very straightforward. It was sort of like this: here's all this knowledge that seems to have been forgotten in the fog of war. So let's just put it on the page. Let's remember who we are here, right?
Which is pretty scary from a scientific point of view. It's like so much for the Whig view of history that we're always getting smarter and better.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's interesting because I have had some conversations during this period with people asking me, how is it that everybody has become so dumb? It's like the entire general IQ is just plummeted, right? And I think there's several things to say about that. Obviously, one of them is that we have seen the Flynn effect in operation before now anyway, right? So there is this sort of gradual potential slide in IQ, which happens when we have some of the influences on ourselves that we have today that we didn't have, say, 30 years ago. Certainly, I would say social media and the influence towards reduction in length and depth of thought that our environments have. People talk about obesogenic environments. I mean, there's got to be a term for environments that generally decrease and depress your ability to think, and so that I think has definitely been the case. But I would also say that, in my observation, the correlation between IQ and sense making during this period has been virtually zero.
Yeah, I agree with that. It seems actually maybe the reverse, right? I mean, so one of the things I've observed is that, it's typically it's the ruling classes, the upper classes, the most educated people who've been the most at lockdowns, but that may be a class interest issue. May not be an intelligence issue, but there does seem to be some, I mean, like, you can't prove this, but some relationship between like high intelligence and high stupidity on matters of lockdowns.
Yeah,
I don't know.
I mean, there's a couple things going on there. One, I think you're right. Yes, there's self-interest properly understood, and the ability to be a James in your own area, basically, to be able to, make advantage for yourself out of this tragedy. And then, that drives the incentive to come up with beautiful rationalizations and apologies for why whatever is being done should be done. Right. I mean, that's the main purpose of our big brains anyway in our everyday lives, right? Rationalize what you already wanted to do. And that has been on display, in force during this period. And of course, these are the people with the big brains. So they got even, bigger and better and more beautiful rationalizations that it takes more cutting analysis and depth of thought to counter. And also, people are vulnerable to the influence of the crowd, no matter what their IQ is. right? Plenty of people in crowds of the past have been smart people. It's not like this somehow attracts only the dumb, right?
Well,
Everybody.
I mean, arguably the ruling class has got even a smaller interest group, community of influence, than the say, working classes, which are tended to meet more people and that sort of thing. So, professors only care about the people on their hallway,
Yeah, yeah.
Or,
Yeah, and also they're very coddled, really, in their modern lives, right? That's been another problem. A lot of the elite are in this, as you call it, the laptop class, right? And they've been the ones making the policy, and they have been um, essentially through the various ways in which we live now, and what status brings to you in terms of your lifestyle. They've been protected from many of the risks that used to be just completely de rigueur in our lives. And the people on the street who are, the truckies, or the people cleaning the roads, or the repairman, or whatever, they are used to taking risks kind of as a normal part of life anyway, and they're close to the reality, right? They're right there at the coalface. And so they just don't have the luxury of being able to wring their hands over a virus that has a 99.9% recovery rates, and for which there is now early treatment and all these other things, right? And to actually stop society. Plus, they've got the back pocket reason as well, which is, they need the money to survive. They don't necessarily have the big bank balances that many of the laptop classes have been able to rest on during this period.
Right. This is a long tendency of, and I wonder if it's a potential problem for, the problem of freedom itself and democracy and equality, that there is a long history of the ruling classes, the upper classes, or the upper tier of society, to imagine themselves to be both clean and deserving of a greater degree of cleanliness than others. So you get these kind of caste systems, or, I mean, this is true in the Deep South, in the United States, but it was also even true. You can read stories in the Bible where there's the lower classes, were considered to be diseased, not worthy of the temple. They had to be cleansed by a rabbi, and even apparently in ancient Rome, there was a tendency to just otherize, sandbag, the merchant class and the working class.
Definitely. And I mean, that's really interesting too, because it shows how culture is a product of economic circumstance, and in this case, circumstance related to health. I mean, it is just true that really nasty diseases can sometimes pass more easily in dirty environments, and that means that, yes, there is a risk there. Now, it's not as extreme as obviously is being depicted, but it certainly is something that's real. And then once you sort of hook into that as a culture and make it part of your ideology, it can be extremely divisive. And we start to then see these sorts of very exclusionist ideologies come up that are also very conveniently in the service of keeping the elites, or the top class, segregated from the unclean, right? And of course, that's then a mechanism of power retention, right? So it is this really interesting, combination of factors that really are about culture responding to the circumstances of the organism. So
and it profoundly impacts on the problem of economic liberalism and liberalism generally, because we need to really have come to terms with the problem of infectious disease and the impact that's had on social and political structures throughout history. But what's fascinating to me, Gigi, is that that I don't think that this would have been a problem that would have occurred to me until this pandemic, right? I mean, this is sort of revealed something to us about which we hadn't really, at least for me, I hadn't really thought that much about.
I will say, I have thought about it in a slightly different flavor, which is the modern ideology of prudishness. So something that really seems to have come along, I wouldn't say really as far back as the Romans. The Romans were very non-prudish by modern standards, but sometime in the sort of Renaissance type of time, Enlightenment time, we started to see this more of an emphasis on things like modesty and properness of behavior. And we had the Victorian era where everything was very proper, right? And even now we have separated bathrooms for men and women. We don't have sex in public. We don't do certain things in public anymore that would have been considered just kind of normal, 2000 years ago. And so I have thought about that. And my co-author, Paul Freiders, and I have certainly considered why that would be. And one of the sort of running theories, I guess, that we have about why that might be the case is that at a certain point in the development of industry, it became very, very advantageous if you could concentrate for a long time on a particular type of specialty, become really, really good at doing something. And that was much more convenient, much more easy to do if you were able to block out distractions like that. There's that pretty girl, or there's that naked guy, or whatever. So if we establish a norm of prudishness, so that it's sort of considered proper not to do certain things in public, then it creates a situation or an environment where that kind of specialization becomes easier for the individual to manage. And then, of course, specialization according to comparative advantage is one of the big pillars of industrial development. And so we've seen that more and more and more. And we do see prudishness more even now amongst the elite sorts of classes. If you go into any truck stop or whatever, you'll see pictures of naked ladies on the walls and stuff, or in a repair shop, you'll see that. There's much less kind of angsty, self-sinning kind of ideology around our core primal needs amongst those sorts of people and then those sorts of occupations than there is amongst the laptop class. But I certainly hadn't considered it as an extension to a broader point about uncleanliness and sort of what is inappropriate to do.
Right. So you have this interlocking relationship now between moral prudery and biological cleanliness. And that all comes together with the vaccines, right? So if you get the shot, that makes you clean, and makes you also a good person and makes you smart.
Yep.
If you don't get the shot, then you're dirty and you're stupid and
person and a danger to society.
And a moral person, right? So all this is like coming together, it's like this big crush, and it's hard even to talk about it because people just just absorb these messages and blend them all into a big
Isn't it amazing? Isn't it amazing? I mean, the human brain is just the most amazing thing, right? I mean, as I find it, so easy for me to get up in the morning and be motivated because I just find it unendingly fascinating how incredible our brains are. And one of the amazing things about them is that we have this capacity for abstraction, which just allows us to do so many things, right? Which no other animal can possibly conceive of doing, but at the same time has the potential to lead us down the garden path, as they say in Australia, to go off the rails really badly. Because when you and I say something, some abstract thing like say liberalism or freedom or something, you and I may think that we are in full agreement about what that thing is, what it means, the implications. We have a whole little mental model about that abstraction in our heads. But I can guarantee you that the model, the actual specifics of the model in each individual person's head who is saying the same abstraction is different. And so at the same time that abstraction allows us to unite as a people, we also have this ability to kind of develop different ideas about what it really means. And then sometimes those fractious tensions come out in the open. And so we can say to each other, yeah, when I said cleanliness, I didn't mean have a vaccine and have this and have that, but somebody else really did, right? Yeah. And so and then talking about it becomes difficult because we thought we were united, but oh no, right? So yeah, again, we need to work out how to communicate with each other, despite the fact that we have to use abstraction to communicate. And those abstractions may not be as shared as we initially thought.
It just occurred to me that we're talking about whether and to what extent a person is vaccinated. 1 vaccine, 2, 3, the the most clean person has like 5 or something like that. But isn't it strange how we have a confession culture too, right? So everybody has to reveal this, and I've been asked this all the time in interviews, like, well, have you had the vaccine? I'm like, I'm just not gonna say. I still feel like, I think. Right. I think we're supposed to have had this sort of respect for privacy that seems to be, almost entirely gone,
Yeah, no, totally. We have a little movement here in regional New South Wales, which is called #NotMyBusiness. And it's actually by business owners. And the idea is that they are going against what the state has prescribed in terms of basically having a medical apartheid system where you're not allowed to come into the business unless you have been, you have vaccination proof evidence. And they're putting up on their their storefronts this #NotMyBusiness, and there's a little video that goes along with it and says, we don't believe in medical apartheid and all this sort of thing. And the thing is that, like any other kind of discrimination based on medical status is at the end of the day, an extra cost on doing business. And if there's, and we know from discrimination studies in economics, the economics of, labor markets where we've looked at discrimination, we know that if there's even just one company that isn't discriminating, that company can eat the lunch of everybody who is discriminating because they don't have to pay all the costs of keeping all the other people, the unclean, out, right? And so as soon as you allow for just a little bit of that, then there should be market forces that kick in to assist the rejection of these damaging discriminatory policies.
Let me ask you, it's a very interesting question, only because I know a lot of people are going to be listening who are Americans, and they know now that you're living in Sydney and you've been there the whole time, right? So I think Americans might have a tendency to otherize Australia's policies in the following sense, like. And maybe I'm speaking about myself, but I found Australia's policy of zero COVID preposterous from the very beginning. I was like, well, you're a tourist country filled with intelligent people. Why would you want to deliberately create, by policy, naive immune systems for an entire country and thereby wreck your position in the world economy? And don't you know that you're going to be made a laughingstock of the world if you keep this up, because COVID is going to come to Australia. And I was looking at the case levels in Australia, by the way, and they're very, very low relative to, per capita. So I think Australia is still can expect a big wave unless there's some cross immunities from SARS-CoV-1 or so. I don't know, but it looks as if Australia's yet to experience the pandemic. Yep. So I guess I had a tendency to sort of say, okay, what's gone wrong among all my favorite wonderful people in Australia that they could have believed this? But I mean, there's a couple of things about that. One is that U.S. started with the zero COVID policy in the early days. This is why Trump was driven to insanity and locked us down, because he kept seeing cases rise and rise and rise. And it was like he didn't want any cases. He wanted no cases. So there's that. We started with a zero COVID policy, but it was already here. So it was not possible. We had to back our way into some quasi-rational position. The other thing is that, don't you think it's possible that we Americans, or really the world, can get a bad impression of Australia based just on the ruling class policies? Like, there's a lot of people who agree with you, right?
Yes, no, there definitely are, but there's also a very strong name and shame culture that's come up, that's really made itself known during this period. And you've seen it in terms of what happened to me last year, right? When I spoke out, I was ridiculed and defamed on Twitter, even though I'm not even on Twitter. And I was called all manner of names: granny killer, and neoliberal, Trump cannot, death cult warrior, Yankee, killer of whatever. I was likened to Ayn Rand, and all they call the eugenicist, all this sort of stuff. And anybody who's paying attention will sort of see that kind of behavior. And even if they disagree with the policies, are they going to really speak up and just ask for that kind of abuse? No, they're just not. And there is a culture in Australia of following authority. And if you put that together with really a very strong desire to be accepted by your group, which is where this mateship kind of culture comes from too, that combination means that a lot of people just stay silent in public. Now, in private, yes, I mean, I've received thousands of emails from people, some of them the most, sweet, heartwarming, full of gratefulness and gratitude and love and support, and, just saying, you're our savior, been likened to Joan of Arc, all these things. I mean, I don't need to add anything more to my feel-good folder, it's amazing what people have written to me, but in private. Right, because they are afraid of that kind of cancellation. I think the other thing that really assisted, unfortunately, in solidifying and locking in this political narrative of we can keep COVID out is the fact that we are an island nation. And so the politicians simply were, presented with this possibility. It seemed very, very tempting, almost, very seductive at the beginning, of saying, look, yes, we can protect you from the thing you're so incredibly frightened of by locking us down, locking us away, right? We won't let anybody else in. So it just plays right into that clean, unclean ideology. And once the politicians start playing that tune, it becomes extremely hard to change keys because, you buck yourself into a corner. And that's why we end up now having this vaccine hero story, and really no conversation at all about early treatments or, randomized control trials for prophylaxis or anything. I mean, we had ivermectin banned by the TGA. I mean, these crazy decisions, which even if it doesn't work, don't ban it. Ivermectin's one of the safest drugs around. So you look at that and you just think, it is a response to what has happened in the political sphere here, which has been assisted by our existence as an island nation, just like New Zealand, unfortunately.
Well, New Zealand seems like a more extreme version of Australia. Like Ardern the other day, I think it's her name.
Jacinda Ardern.
Yeah, somebody actually said, look, I know you don't want to think about it this way, but it seems almost, and somebody could describe it, that you're trying to create a two-class society of the vaccinated, the unvaccinated, the free and the unfree. She said, yep, that's exactly what we're doing. Did you see that interview?
I didn't see that interview, but it doesn't surprise me one bit. It's absolutely offensive. It's so offensive. I've had people sending me photos of just the signs on walls and sort of shop fronts that says, vaccinate, proof of vaccination needed. All welcome, proof of vaccination needed. It is like 1984. This sort of, and in Melbourne, of course, the carrying call was, what was it? Staying apart keeps us together, right? It's George Orwell again.
Well, that was, and with the songs and everything, it was just a little bit much. And that was already the summer of last year when they were doing all this. Staying apart keeps us together, whatever the thing is. But now, what do you make of the following problem? So all the lockdowners then invested everything in the vaccines, but now it turns out, and we learned this, I guess, over the summer, that the vaccines are, as they say, leaky, right? So, and now we're talking about boosters, and then even those are not quite doing the thing, and so on. So I my impression is that a lot of the proponents of vaccines really thought that this was going to be their way out of lockdowns, but now it turns out that they are not. I'm not sure how widely understood that is, but all the data I'm seeing suggests that they're not.
Totally agreed. And I mean, I think the most logical direction for things to progress is that as we learn about the vaccines fading protection and also potentially nasty side effects and long-term effects we don't even know about, I think the easier pivot will be towards something that is more efficient and just less costly to enforce at a business point of call, and also at in terms of vaccine passports or whatever. It just becomes too difficult. So I think maybe rapid antigen testing or testing on arrival or something, a really quick sort of test, or proof of natural immunity through an antibody test or T cells or something that maybe you have to do once every 6 months. Instead of having proof of the vaccine itself, we may go in that direction. And of course, we're getting different vaccines, and you never know. Maybe in 4 or 5 months, we're going to have the Valneva vaccine or the COVAX vaccine that's being developed here on the market, and maybe more people will be willing to have them because they're using more traditional technology, and maybe that will help. And they may be more long lasting, but still the cost, the incremental cost of constantly checking to see everybody's vaccine status, well, I mean, we can't maintain that.
The other thing, Gigi, if I may say so, and every time I bring this topic up, people want to shush me, but what about those who just have made the rational decision? Maybe they've never been exposed to COVID, but they like a robust immune system, and they're willing to be, a little bit under the weather for a few days, in exchange for which you get, immunity.
It's a very touchy, it's a touchy subject. I tend to agree with you, Jeffrey. I think that people should be free to put themselves into a situation in which they may risk being infected. I know that there is a kind of a moral argument against that that is mounted frequently by particular people in the medical profession who say, we would never want to be advocating for someone to voluntarily be infected with COVID.
But should people be free to live their lives normally, even without a proof of natural immunity, even without, just based on an individual risk calculation? I'd rather take the risk of COVID. I mean, that's been my position from the beginning.
Completely agree. I mean, look, from my personal, if I were queen, which I hope I never am, and I hope nobody ever is, but if I were queen, that we would drop all of this stuff right now. We would open all borders, we stop all the testing, we stop all of this stuff. What we would do is protect people who are in the old care communities, aged care homes, and we would be investing heavily in prophylaxis and early treatment. And of course, we would keep the vaccines on hand in case people wanted them, but we would also be doing, very rigorous, independent, long-term testing on side effects and other kinds of things. And we'd be encouraging development of other vaccine technology and other technology to treat this thing, right? But we would immediately drop. But that's me. That's me being queen.
That's
right?
also what we did for the last 100 years.
Absolutely, right. But in terms of what's actually reasonable to expect will happen, I don't see that happening. I see a move towards a slightly less costly regime, which still does have somewhere in it the idea of COVID is dangerous and we must protect people from it, and therefore we must take extra precautions, even though we're not putting those precautions in place for, who knows, let's say tuberculosis, HIV, pneumonia, any of the other influenza viruses, blah, 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 long list. We don't care about those apparently, but we care about, COVID. And so I just don't see it being a practical direction, as much as I would love that to be the case. In terms of the natural immunity question, I mean, to be frank, I would rather risk exposure directly to the virus than take one of the current crop of the COVID vaccines based on the data that I've seen. And I work very hard to keep my immune system doing well. I had a run this morning, lots of sun here in Australia, and we are in Asia. So as you said, I think it's likely that actually the COVID lethality here, the cases may rise a lot. And I agree with you, that's going to happen once we open borders, but the lethality of it may be, less than the global average because of the fact that we are in Asia and we will have had, sweeps through from other previous COVID type viruses, which probably give a lot of us deep immunity in T cells and whatever. So I kind of, and with all the sunlight again that we have and the general sportsy culture and everything, of course, people in Victoria have been seriously damaged by the policies enacted there.
Right. So what is the political outlook there in Sydney? Because you don't have a Dan Andrews there in Sydney relative to Melbourne, right? Melbourne.
No. Yeah, so Melbourne is the capital city of the state of Victoria, and the premier of the state of Victoria, Dan Andrews, is the person in the premier across all the state premiers in Australia who has gone the hardest and the most draconian in terms of these restrictions on liberties. And we have all manner of political cartoons now, Danistan, and it's hilarious. I can send you lots of these resistance art, which is so uplifting. But we had here in New South Wales a premier named Gladys Berejiklian, who for a very long time avoided lockdowns, and I think was really struggling to toe that line for a long time, and really tried her best to continue. But then she got embroiled in a corruption scandal thing, and so she very quickly stepped down. And I think it was not just the corruption story. I think it was probably something else to do with COVID policy. And we now have a new premier who has been a staunch advocate in the past for liberty. He's very religious. He has 6 kids, a Catholic, I think, but he's very much in favor of freedom. And so I'm cautiously hopeful about that. I had a conversation with his advisor about a month ago before he became premier. And I'm sort of, and I got a response. So I'm hopeful that maybe that was a little bit of assistance for him in trying to toe the line and, stay the course, basically. The way that, Ron DeSantis has done in Florida, right? There are lots of pressures to stop that foolishness. What are you trying to do, right? Because, you're creating an example that will hurt the people who are trying to impose lockdowns and trying to continue them, right? So, of course, they have
in Australia, you can't travel to Victoria. You can't travel to Western Australia. You can't travel anywhere.
I can't travel to Queensland. And I mean, I'm thinking of trying to get to Victoria in another couple of weeks. I'm supposed to be speaking there. And so we'll see whether things change by then, but it's ridiculous. I mean, these domestic lockdowns on top of the international borders being closed,
right.
I mean, if you're going to close the international borders, that's bad enough. But then on top of that, put everybody into this lockdown state. I mean, it's madness, right? And it just hasn't been recognized as such. And we haven't had the kind of cost benefit analyses of this policy in Australia that is typical of any kind of policy that has broad reaching effects on the population. And there are reasons for that. I think as soon as you start looking at the idea of doing cost benefit analysis for lockdowns, you realize that they're a madness. So they can't be defended.
Yeah, and it's a problem too, especially for the travel restrictions, because like even in the US, a lot of people who are against the lockdown, school closures, church closures, business closures, favored the border restrictions against China, which were imposed as early as January, I think, January 2020. When Trump And I'm mortified when I look back at my own writing. It's like I never wrote and condemned that. I never said anything bad about it. But then so March 12th comes and suddenly it's like, okay, you're from Australia, you can't come here. Then it's UK, then it's Spain, and then it's everywhere in Europe. And that's when it just hit me. I thought, well, this is appalling. And even to this day, those are still in place, and we're just making very small steps to have vaccinated only visitors. So we shattered what you and I have taken for granted, and most everybody has taken for granted for the last better part of 70 years, which is the freedom to travel here and travel there and do what you want.
Totally agree. And, and I think back to my childhood. My mother took me around the world when I was 11 years old on something called the Semester at Sea program, where we stopped in 10 different countries, 10 different ports. And we were literally on a ship going around the world. And those experiences that I had during that trip were formative for me. I mean, I was, 11, I was soaking up all these different cultures and different ways of thinking, and, just the diversity that you see in that kind of experience. And it saddens me that we have, kept now 2 years worth of our young people from having those kinds of experiences, being able to go on exchange, being able to just, travel is hard enough. International travel, it's stressful enough, right? I mean, we know you're crossing time zones and you different food, and when are you going to go to the toilet, and you have enough water, and and having to get the itineraries planned out, and who's got the rental car, and what household you're staying at. All those things are already complicated enough for a poor young person trying to learn and grow and develop and expand their horizons, to then put a layer on top of that says, oh yeah, and you have all this medical stuff you got to deal with, is cruel. And it's going to, I really feel this is going to create a cost that is not being recognized at the moment either, even by people who are looking at the disruption to education that we've inflicted upon our children and thinking about the long-term cost of that. But but this exchange and being able to visit other cultures, it's hugely important for keeping us a peaceful and vibrant society.
What we've lost, it's funny, with economists for a couple hundred years have tried to alert people to think a little bit abstractly about the unseen costs, not just the direct costs, but the unseen costs of the things we do.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking about drafting an article about it, but we're not even there. When we think about what we've lost in terms of art,
Well, I totally agree. And it's been amazing being an economics educator during this period. I teach economics here at the university. And one of the courses I teach is a first-year one called Economic Perspectives, where we talk about the big ideas of economics. And of course, opportunity cost is a huge one. And the story of, the parable of the broken window by Frederick Bastiat is a great one, which is, the little boy comes up and throws a baseball or something, or a stone through a window. And, first people are like, oh, that's a pity. But then they say, well, at least it'll give work to the glazier. At least we'll be able to, put him to work, and it'll help the economy. And of course, Bastiat's point is, yes, but wouldn't it have been better to take that money and do something else to improve everybody's life and livelihood and length of life and all the things we want, instead of having to fix something? So, this is the paradox of the GDP measures, for example, as well. The Exxon Valdez bill counts as a positive for GDP because you have to do all the cleanup, right? Now that's nonsensical. And of course, you never see what is lost, what is given up on anybody's spreadsheet. It's never visible. It's always in our minds. And we always have to just mount an argument about, well, based on what has been seen in the history of humanity and the history of cultures and societies like ours, we would have expected that all of this sacrificed GDP would have been put towards spending on, individual preferences, but also roads and schools and hospitals and everything else through our, governmental investments. And those spendings from the private sector and the public sector, individuals, they directly promote human welfare. And that's what we have sacrificed. And it's so difficult to have that conversation with people who have been, wrapped up in this narrative of look at what's in front of you and respond only to that. Look at the suffering old person on a ventilator with COVID and respond only to that. And if you don't respond only to that, you are a bad person.
Yeah, and but even these invisible costs, they're huge, and they never go away, and we'll never know what they are. But what some people are calling now collateral damage is becoming a little bit overwhelming. Like U.S. hospitals are now full, but not from COVID, but from cancer, accidental injury, which is our euphemism for attempted suicide. all kinds of diseases people have from decayed immune systems and obesity and drug overdoses. So it's becoming a little bit overwhelming. I mean, it's like definitely underreported, but the collateral, the observable collateral damage from lockdowns is getting a little bit overwhelming. Not to mention the policy outcomes, from the inflation and the debt crowding out of investment and so on.
Exactly, and I think that does. I mean, I hate to ever wish suffering on people, but I think that the more evident suffering that is happening now will, again, speed our recovery to sort of a normal perspective on what's important in life. And so in that sense, it is in service to humanity and to our recovery from this disastrous, policy mistakes.
Long term. Do you want to put a date on that? What are you thinking in your own mind in terms of, like, if you were going to imagine a time period in which people have, shaken off this group psychology of panic and hysteria and anti-liberalism, and we find a way back towards civilized principles of living?
So there are lots of factors, obviously, and I don't have a crystal ball, but the kinds of, pressures that we are seeing now in very kind of embryonic form, I think will get stronger, and they take a while to flow through the system. So, for example, one of the big pressures in favor of recovery is that some areas of the world, like Florida or Texas or Sweden, will be back to normal. And to the extent that people will be able to see that and recognize and be jealous of that, right, they will put pressure on their own home politicians, or they will simply move. If they can travel, right? So if they are able, if they're granted permission to go to some other place, which is having a more joyful and vibrant approach to life, then they will do that, and that will eventually deplete the populations in the areas which have clung on to this damaging ideology. But again, that takes time, right? So. And of course, it takes time for crowds to dissolve. We've seen from history, it took time for the prohibition crowd to dissolve and for the witch hunting crowd to dissolve. I mean, we're talking about years. We're not talking about months. So my sort of rough guesstimate at the moment in terms of time frame is it's going to be between 5 and 10 years before we get back to real normal. And over the course of the next 5 years, I do expect it'll be sort of like, when you have a baby and every year is like a sea change in your ability to do more things, right? Because initially you can't even sleep, right? And then I can sleep a little bit. Now I just can't eat as what I would like to. Oh, now I can sleep and eat. Oh, now we can also do some fun things. Now I can even do more things. So every year of that, child's first 5 years of life is like a, wow, I just discovered that life can be a little more like it was. And I think that's what it'll be like with us. I do think that, to the extent that the vaccines are seen to fail more or not be the hero solution that we thought, and to the extent that we are able to get stories of early treatment and prophylaxis out there and taken up by good doctors, to the extent that new media channels and new community organizations that become successful and grow legs and start to influence, all of those things, they can happen with more or less success. If they're all really successful, maybe we're back to normal in 3 to 4 years. But if not, then maybe it's a little longer.
At what point did you realize we're in for the long haul here? Because the lockdowns happened, March 2020. I suppose that is true in Australia as well as. Mm-hmm. Remember in Australia, we're watching all these congratulatory politicians, saying we beat COVID. This was like July of 2020. It was hilarious. We're the envy of the world. Yeah, right. But at what point well, let me ask you this. When did you start your book? At what point did you realize this is going to consume the better part of your second half of your career?
So even in April and early May, I was still hoping that this whole thing would just blow over. Really. I was thinking, well, surely people can't stay so panicked and so fearful for that many more months. I mean, aren't they going to realize that, life sucks when you focus on one bad thing, and we should appreciate what we have and count your blessings and take a practical approach and all the stuff that, happens to you when, you sort of recover from a significant fright, right? And you sort of recover your senses. Okay, but what I was missing really was the crowd dynamic. I didn't think that was going to take hold so powerfully and so completely in terms of dominating the political narrative, particularly in Australia. So I think it was around Probably late June, July, when it started to dawn on me that this was just not going to go away anytime soon, and that I was going to be fighting for the recovery of normalcy here in Australia, despite the fact that everybody was saying it was now normal again. I mean, we couldn't travel. How is that normal? That's not normal, right? And so I started sort of, I mean, I had been talking with Paul Frieders during the whole time because he's a great friend and colleague of mine. We've written previous books together. We've written many articles together, and we're basically just intellectual buddies. And so we had been talking about this. He'd been blogging a lot on COVID issues, even from as far back as March. I'd been talking on my national radio program about how this was damaging what we were doing. We should stop. And we spent basically our entire fourth season of The Economist on ABC Radio National here talking about COVID. So Paul and I just we were continually putting the voice out there, but we weren't getting anywhere. And so we sort of looked at each other and we're like, I think we need to actually write a book about this. And that was probably in around September, maybe August, September of 2020. So it took us, the better part of a year to put the book together, and drawing bits and pieces from different places and packing it in and bringing on Michael Baker as a layperson's writer, because Paul and I have this previous book right here, which is lovely, but kind of eggheadish, like somewhat dense, you might say. And so we recognized that on an issue that was this powerful and this relatable, really, to the person on the street, COVID policy and why we've got it wrong and what we need to do next, we needed somebody to help us make our writing more accessible and bounce a bit, make it more lively. And so Michael was perfect for that. And he also is a big skeptic of these policies, big nonconformist, and so it seems to work, and we put lots of time into it, and I just it has become obviously something that is still not going away, and as you say, will be consuming the better part of what I'm working on probably for the next couple of years at least, and I hope that this period generates an explosion in research about bad policymaking and the impact of our policies, and that those unseen costs you were speaking of will be at least estimated by some people, some good economists, and that it'll provide fodder for generations of PhD students, really, to be able to look back on this period.
I'm really proud of the book, especially since Brownstone published it, but also because I think it's a bit of a monument to the times, right? So now we have, and this must satisfy you too, that now we have a really coherent documentation of the strange period in which we live.
This was part of what we wanted from the book, absolutely, and putting those initial stories in there from the Jasmines and even from the Janes, right, which we're taking from people's posts, that captures what was really happening in these people's lives and in their minds, and I think that's important. It's a kind of a historical documentary.
Yeah. Do you expect you're gonna? Are you thinking about a follow-up, or I don't want to? we're still working with this one. Let me ask you this, instead of asking that question, how busy do you stay with interviews and book presentations, that sort of thing now?
Pretty busy. I'm also teaching 2 courses, and I'm the director of education at the university's School of Economics, and I'm the deputy head of school. So I have a few things going on, right? And so this period has been very, I mean, I'm working pretty much nonstop. Not like we can do that much anyway. Can't go out to see plays and stuff like that. Hopefully next year. But it's been a very, 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 very busy period, and it does. I am getting a lot of interest about the book. I would say that it takes a while for the ideas to percolate through. So I'll send books out, and then a couple weeks later, people say, "Oh my gosh, this was great. I want some more." And so then I have to send more books out, and so it has to percolate. The various different worlds that we kind of expose in the book. It takes a while for people to really get their head around them and recognize, oh yeah, okay, now I see this is something I've got to push out further, and we need to spread the word about this. So I think it'll probably keep selling. I'm hoping, as a Christmas present, it would be a great choice for Jasmines around the world.
The thing that struck me about the book is that I finished it. And I thought, like, obviously I was I'm on Team Gigi from the beginning here, but I thought, if any COVIDophobe or lockdowner read this book, I can't imagine that he or she would come away not shaken, at least, a little bit disoriented and confused about the possibility that they might be wrong about everything. And that's one of the reasons I really thought it was such a compelling book. And based on, do you read the Amazon reviews?
I have seen them. Yeah, I've seen most of them anyway. Yeah,
really good.
Yeah, no, very, very positive. I mean, there's one which I had to laugh at, and I actually would like to extend my thanks to the person who gave us a 1-star review, saying something like, total tripe, unless you're an anti-lockdown or anti-vax mandater or believe that COVID is really just like a regular flu, don't waste your money. And I thought, well, that's it. Yeah, because thank you for the advertisement, right? But yeah, no, they're very positive reviews, and I've gotten so many, again, private emails talking about basically the same thing. Now, on the point of whether reading the book will convince someone who has committed themselves, particularly publicly, to the veracity and the truth and justice of the policies we've implemented during this period, I think, one needs to not underestimate the need of people to maintain a positive image of themselves. And so, as much as we might like to, in our crusades, to like push this book in their face, just look at this, how can you possibly deny, right? That's not how it works, right? That's not how you convince people. And the people who we need to read this book also need a face-saving story, so that to themselves and, for their children, for their grandchildren, they still have a story of why they're still a good person. And that is one of the biggest challenges during this period, because this has been such a colossal cock up in so many ways, right? That if you've been seen to be associated with it and to be, basically calling the shots or cheering on the people who are calling the shots, where do you hide? What can you possibly use, right? The only possible fig leaves are things to do with fog of war. We didn't know at the time, even though we did have knowledge. So, that's not true. Or just, didn't know what I was doing, or, I was taking orders. We've heard that one before. So, that kind of, what we're asking of someone who is reading this book, who has been committed to the pro-lockdown cause, is a huge, huge request, which most people will not be able to fulfill. And I fear that if they do, they will be probably living with, PTSD or, just some self-hating for most of the rest of their lives. And so this is a real challenge.
Has this experience had any kind of effect on your opinion of the relationship between good science and public policy, or the capacity of the common person to absorb the realities of data into their lives and act on it?
Look, it definitely has shaken my faith in the system of peer review that we use in social science and also in hard science, in a way that it hadn't been shaken before. I mean, I recognize that there were issues with, favors being traded, and if you know the editor, then you can get your article in or whatever. But it's the impact of this crowd psychology on those processes that has been really eye-opening for me. Like we are just as vulnerable in science, just like the high IQ people and the low IQ people are equally vulnerable to the crowd dynamic. Scientists too are human, and we're just as vulnerable to these kinds of, damaging ideologies, and just signing up for the crowd's morality and the crowd's truth, whatever that happens to be at the moment, rather than, towing a line on trying to actually query, where is truth? What is the right way? What is really going on here? To the extent that we can figure it out. Obviously, there's no objective reality, there's no objective truth, but we certainly seek it in science. That's the whole point, right? I mean, this is one of my favorite documentary film from the BBC from 1973, I think, The Ascent of Man. Jacob Bronowski talks about how science is a testament to what we can know, even though we are fallible, right? And so it is all about trying to pursue that ultimately impossible goal of finding truth. And to the extent that, this period has shown me anything, it's shown me the vulnerability of science as a group to the same kinds of very misguided and damaging, destructive dynamics that everybody else is subject to. So yes, that's been hard. I don't know if I'm going to be embraced back into the community of economists in Australia ever in the same way. I've got people who absolutely hate my guts, won't go on to debate with me. I've had multiple appearances where the host tries to find someone who will, be there with me and kind of provide a counterpoint, and nobody will do it. They ask multiple people, they won't do it. People hate me. People see me as like almost literally the devil. So that's a real issue going forward, reconciling across those kinds of divides. In terms of whether people really understand, the dynamics at play in science, I don't think they do. The person on the street, I think, trusts science still more than is warranted. And something like peer review sounds to them like a reasonably pretty good idea, as it often is in non-COVID times. You do get some value out of that peer review process. So you don't want to just throw out the baby with the bathwater, but because of the way that the assignment of referees works in a sudden crisis situation, if you get one paper that's out there and publishes something that's misleading, boy, that bad idea can grow long legs and just be around for a long time. And that's been what's happened during this period. And we're going to take a while to recover from that for sure.
But I think last I checked, there's something like 100,000 published studies on related to COVID and lockdowns, you know, everything associated with it, the medical aspects, scientific aspects of it. And so then you have a problem. It's like, you know, which ones are you going to look at? Because it's just been this flood. I mean, you saw that link on Brownstone. We had 91 studies on natural immunity. It's like, okay, well, how many do we need before people start paying attention? 910?
Look, I mean, the problem is during this period, there's been no scarcity of facts and evidence, right?
Yeah.
The scarce thing has been common sense. Right. And really that it is not something that you need to have a PhD to work out, which is why we've seen the most sense making coming from people like the truckies or the repair people, or there's the blue collar workers, because they can sniff a rat. These people have street smarts. And really the PhD training only gives you the tools to be able to better rationalize in some florid way some really dumb policy, right? And so, yeah, I think knowing that, there are going to be studies coming out saying this, saying that, saying the other thing, it's useful to know that will happen sometimes for political reasons. Not every peer-reviewed study is gold, right? Not everyone is. And even if you don't really know the ins and outs and the technical details and the mathematics that you need in order to decipher a particular study, you can use your nose, you can use your street smarts and just try to kind of sense check what you're reading as a layperson. And I think it's the responsibility of those of us who can penetrate those technical articles to call them out on their unethical statements and assertions and incorrect inferences, because if we don't, who will?
That's right. And it takes so much time, and we've been doing it for a year and a half. We're going to be at 2 years in this, so we're going to be 5 years deep. Gigi, thank you so much for visiting with me tonight. It's wonderful. Thank you so much for writing this amazing book that I'm certain will stand the test of time. And so you've been glorious. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Jeffrey. Thank you for all your support and your unending energy and trying to crusade for what is right and true.
Thank you, Gigi. Good night.